It began with a nightmare. A frightened 14-year-old, haunted by visions she could not escape, of blood, of screams, of a woman's ghost. She told the police her dreams were real, that a woman had suffered and died in a third-floor apartment. The officers listened, then dismissed her. A child's nightmare, they thought. And in a city where certain dangers were better not seen, that dismissal was almost routine. Until they found it, a child's toy, altered beyond recognition, inside the skull of Fan Man-yee. Could you recognize evil if it wore an innocent face? What drives a mind to place horror inside a child's toy? This is not just a crime. It is a mirror of a culture's shadows, a story of power, of sadism, and of the human capacity for symbolic cruelty. This is the case of the Hello Kitty murders. The timeline of this crime is in many ways simple, but beneath the surface are fractures and silences. Facts alone cannot tell us why this happened. Only in the shadows, in what is left unsaid, do the deeper truths begin to emerge. In early 1999, Fan Man-yee, by then working as a nightclub hostess, took approximately 4,000 Hong Kong dollars from one of her clients, triad member Chan Man-lok. When Chan discovered the theft, he demanded not only repayment, but an additional 10,000 Hong Kong dollars, an inflated compensation, which is common in extortion practices. Fan returned what she could, but the demand remained unmet. And so, a small crime, an act of desperation, became the pretext of something far worse. A question remains. Was this about money being paid back, or about something far more sinister? In March 1999, Chan Man-lok, with accomplices Leong Shin-cho and Leong Wai-lun, abducted Fan and imprisoned her in a third-floor apartment in Tim Sha Tsui. Also present is a 14-year-old girl, only known as Ah Fong, a child entangled in Chan's orbit of coercion and control. For nearly a month, Fan Man-yee was subjected to a pattern of escalating cruelty. She was beaten with metal pipes and household objects, often while suspended, forced to serve as a target for their anger. At times, the violence became relentless. She endured dozens of blows in a single episode. Her injuries were intentionally aggravated. Spices were rubbed into open wounds. Her legs and feet were severely burned with candle wax and melted plastic, leaving her unable to stand or walk. She was deprived of dignity in every possible way, forced to endure acts meant to humiliate and break her spirit. At the whim of her captors, she was made to feign enjoyment, to smile and laugh on command, with a threat of even harsher punishment if she refused. Her hands were tied overhead with elastic wires for hours, causing excruciating swelling, and any attempt to relieve her pain was met with further blows. Each new act of cruelty chipped away at her strength, her autonomy, and her hope. The suffering she endured was systematic and unrelenting, a deliberate attempt to erase her sense of self. And all the while, the sounds of her suffering drifted beyond those apartment walls. Yet no one came. Why? Why did no one hear her screams, her cries, her pleas for help? Was that room the only one occupied on the whole floor? Or possibly someone heard, but either the neighbors thought it was a normal occurrence, or neighbors just chose to close their ears from the horrors that are happening. Between April 14th and 16th, Fan Man-yee's life ended while her captors were away and in the darkness of the room where they kept her. When they returned, they took deliberate steps to conceal what they had done. Her body was dismembered. Her skull was sewn into a Hello Kitty mermaid doll, an object of innocence, now corrupted into a symbol of power and possession. Other remains were discarded across the city, in bins and alleyways. Only her skull, one tooth, and several organs were ever recovered. In May of 1999, it was not law enforcement or neighbors who exposed the crime. It was Ah Fong, because she was plagued by nightmares. She came forward, speaking of horrors no child should know. At first, the police doubted her, but on May 24th, they entered the apartment on Granville Road and discovered the truth. And so, we couldn't help asking, why did it take weeks and the fractured conscience of a child for this crime to come to light? What forces held this horror in the dark, even as it unfolded in the heart of a city? But even the timeline cannot explain why these human beings acted as they did. To possibly understand that, we must look beyond the acts themselves and into the forces that might have shaped those who committed them. Because in this case, maybe there are no simple monsters. It is easy, comforting even, to reduce stories like these to good and evil, to believe that some people are simply monsters and others simply victims. But the truth may be always more tangled, and when we look closely at the human beings caught in this case, what we find is not simple. We find lives shaped by abandonment, exploitation, fear, and a society that has the tendency to look away. Born in 1976, Fan Man-yee was abandoned as a child and raised in an orphanage in Matawai. At 15, aged out and with nowhere to go, she was left to survive the streets of Hong Kong. Her addiction followed until she stumbled into the world of prostitution, but so did resilience. By 1996, she was trying to rebuild herself. She was married to a man she met through her work. By the late 1998, Fan Man-yee became a mother. She quit drugs, took work as a nightclub hostess, tried to make a better life for her infant son. But poverty, stigma, and exploitation had followed her too long. Before she was a victim in this case, she was a child seemingly abandoned by the systems meant to protect her. And by the time violence claimed her life, the system had already failed her many times over. Only known by the pseudonym Ah Fong, the other girl included in this case was just 14. She was publicly called the girlfriend of Chan Man-lok, a mid-level triad member. However, this word conceals far more than it reveals. Reports suggest that Ah Fong had been groomed and drawn into Chan's orbit through exploitation and coercion. What psychologists now call coercive control, a system of manipulation that fractures autonomy and distorts a victim's moral frame. In that apartment, she witnessed unspeakable acts, and in some, or maybe many moments, she participated. When asked why, she answered, "I had a feeling it was for fun." But can we take those words at face value? Or are they the words of a 14-year-old whose sense of right and wrong had already been dismantled? Do you think Ah Fong should be considered as an accomplice, or that she was just a child shaped by the forces she could neither name or escape? And then, there were three men. Chan Man-lok, 34, a member of the Wo triad, a man whose world revolved around debt collection, drug trafficking, and violence. Leong Shin-cho, 27, and Leong Wai-lun, 21, both young men, embedded in the same networks of organized crime. Their actions in this case were brutal, unforgivable. But like all human beings, these men may not have been born monsters. They have become a product of a world that thrived in violence. Their behaviors were modeled, rewarded, and normalized in the criminal subcultures they inhabited. This may be an example of what social learning theory teaches us, that cruelty in the right or wrong environment can be learned like any other skill. And in late 1990s Hong Kong, such environments were not hard to find. The city's media of the time glamorized triad culture, glorifying violence, hypermasculinity, and domination as symbols of status. In these circles, violence became script, not an aberration, but a learned performance. Social learning theory shows us that in the right context, cruelty becomes not only normalized, but rewarded. And the symbolic acts in this case, like forcing Fan to smile, embedding her remains inside a child's toy, may be understood, at least in part, through the lens of dehumanization, a psychological mechanism described in moral disengagement theory. According to psychologist Albert Bandura, dehumanization is one of the ways individuals psychologically distance themselves from the harm they cause. When perpetrators perceive a victim as less than fully human, whether as an object, an animal, or something disposable, they suppress their empathy and permit themselves to commit acts of cruelty that would otherwise conflict with their moral boundaries. In this context, Fan Man-yee was not treated as a person. Her pain was mocked, her body desecrated. The transformation of her skull into a corrupted symbol of innocence, a child's toy. This reflects more than just brutality. It may reflect an attempt to strip her of her humanity altogether. While no single theory can fully explain such acts, Bandura's work offers a framework for understanding how otherwise ordinary individuals come to commit extraordinary harm, not just through hatred, but through the erosion of moral recognition. These men may not have been born as monsters, but they learned to become what their world valued the most. Given all these, one cannot help but wonder, if you had lived their life, shaped by the same streets and the same broken systems, would you have made a different choice? Is there a sense of morality truly born from free will, or is it carved by circumstance more than we care to admit? And if individuals were shaped in such a way, what does that reveal about the system that allowed it to happen? When the moment for justice finally arrived, did that system face its own reflection? Or did it, like so many before it, quietly turn away? By the time this case reached trial in late 2000, more than a year had passed since Fan Man-yee's final cries echoed through the walls of Tim Sha Tsui. Now the question before the court was no longer what happened. That much was undeniable. The question was, could justice fully account for it? 3 men stood trial. Chan Man-lok, Liu Xing-cho, and Leung Wai-lun were charged with murder, false imprisonment, and preventing lawful burial. For 6 weeks, the court heard testimony, much of it resting on the words of a 14-year-old girl. The evidence of violence was overwhelming. It was widely reported that Fan Man-yee's cause of death was drug overdose, reportedly self-administered while in captivity. Her captors even argued she died from an overdose. However, many experts maintain that she actually succumbed to her injuries, with the jury ultimately concluding there was insufficient evidence to prove the overdose theory over the brutal wounds she suffered. But one detail remained elusive. How exactly had Fan died, and what actually caused her death? The state of her remains, fragmented, degraded, left this central question unanswered. Could they prove that her injuries alone had caused her death? The jury was unconvinced. In the end, all 3 were convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter. And the harshest sentence possible under the circumstance, life imprisonment. Given the depravity of the evidence and the nature of the crime, was manslaughter enough as a conviction? And what of Ah Fong, the girl whose testimony unlocked the case? She was never charged. Instead, she was granted full immunity in exchange for her testimony. Was this an act of protection, recognition of her youth, her likely grooming? Or was it a necessary bargain, forged in a system desperate for a conviction? To this day, it remains unclear whether justice chose to see her as a victim, perpetrator, or both. Beyond the courtroom, another story was taking shape. In the headlines, media coverage of the case zeroed in on a single gruesome detail: the Hello Kitty doll. It was an image that captured public horror, but one that may have also reduced the story to a grotesque spectacle. This kind of selective storytelling is what maybe communication scholars refer to as narrative framing. It's not just about what gets told, but how it's told and what that emphasis invites us to focus on. Narrative framing is the process by which certain details are highlighted while others are minimized or excluded to shape how an audience interprets a story. It directs our attention, activates certain emotions or values, and subtly influences how we assign meaning, causality, and even moral judgment. In the case of Fan Man-yee, the media's repeated focus on the doll, an object symbolizing innocence twisted into something horrifying, may have unintentionally framed the crime as a bizarre anomaly, a sensational mystery, rather than a symptom of deeper social failings. Her story, marked by poverty, addiction, stigma, and systemic abandonment, was often pushed to the background. The cruelty of her death became the headline, but the vulnerabilities that made her a target rarely did. While narrative framing doesn't fully explain why the public remembered the doll more than the woman, it does offer one possible reason. The framing of the crime emphasized shock over context and horror over humanity. And when the coverage centers on spectacle, it risks hiding the very conditions that made the crime possible in the first place. But the silences in this case began long before the headlines. In the late 1990s, Hong Kong was a city of widening inequalities, where the gap between the rich and the poor was growing, and marginalized communities were increasingly left to fend for themselves. For women like Fan Man-yee, the lack of social protection, for orphans, for sex workers, for the addicted, meant being trapped in cycles of exploitation. The underground economy, like drugs, debt bondage, sex work, thrived in spaces where law and state protection rarely reached. By the time Fan entered that apartment, she was already a person the system had failed repeatedly. So we must ask, what did the justice system omit? When the verdict was read, what voices, what truths remained unheard? How did the culture of silence shape Hong Kong's memory of this crime? And when the media gave us the image of a doll, what stories did it leave untold? By now, the contours of this case may seem clear. A woman was tortured, a child was involved, 3 men were imprisoned, a city was shaken. But that clarity may be still an illusion, because beneath the facts of this case lie questions that no court ruling or headline can resolve. Questions about guilt, about complicity, about who we choose to punish and who we choose to forget. Think about Ah Fong, a 14-year-old who both witnessed and participated in Fan Man-yee's suffering. Was this cruelty? Or was it the fractured morality of a child shaped by coercive control, a dynamic in which abusers distort reality, making their victims complicit on their own trauma? And if so, was her immunity true justice, or was it convenient absolution? Now consider the neighbors. For nearly a month, Fan Man-yee's screams echoed through these walls. Yet no police report was filed, no door was knocked upon, no hand reached out. Why? What could possibly explain this? In environments where violence is common, the mind can begin to adapt. It may be explained by what psychologists call habituation, the process by which the brain, exposed to repeated stimuli like shouting or conflict, gradually learns to tune them out. What once set off alarms becomes background noise, a part of the everyday. But in these streets, there may have been something more. Sociologists may describe this as normalization of deviance, when behaviors that once seemed unthinkable slowly become accepted as normal. In neighborhoods marked by triad influence, where coercion, debt enforcement, and violence disputes are woven into daily life, even extreme suffering can be reinterpreted as just another incident. So this may be one of the reasons why Fan Man-yee's screams and pleas for help went unanswered, not because they weren't heard, but perhaps because too many had already learned to look away. And then comes the dynamic of the group, the bystander effect. Each individual, hearing the screams, looked to others for cues. Seeing no one else respond, they assume, perhaps it is not serious, perhaps someone else will act. And layered over all of this is something that may have understood through the lens of pluralistic ignorance, a phenomenon where, in the absence of visible concern, people assume others see no problem and suppress their own doubts. In Fan Man-yee's case, neighbors may have heard her cries, the thuds, but seeing no one else reacted, they may have hesitated. Each person mistook the collective silence for reassurance, when in reality, it was a shared uncertainty. With that, the inaction became a norm, not by intent, but maybe by illusion. Finally, beneath every institutional failure and individual hesitation, possibly lies a deeper cultural undercurrent, what Stanley Cohen calls the culture of silence. In Hong Kong, a city where social harmony is often valued above confrontation, residents are subtly conditioned to avert their eyes to maintain the appearance of calm, even when disorder festers beneath. Certain dangers become unspeakable, certain screams unhearable. In neighborhoods where triad influence shapes daily life, this silence becomes more than cultural. It becomes a survival strategy. Speaking out isn't just discouraged, it is dangerous. So even the most desperate cries like Fan Man-yee's can dissolve into the ambient noise of the city, not because no one heard, but because too many had learned or were taught that looking away was safer than knowing, safer than acknowledging. And as Cohen reminds us, denial isn't always about ignorance. Sometimes it's a deliberate, practiced refusal to see what's right in front of us. And finally, consider ourselves. Why did public attention fixate on the image of the Hello Kitty doll, while the deeper rot of the organized exploitation remained largely unexamined? This may be understood through the lens of narrative framing. By spotlighting a single grotesque symbol, the media defined the horror in a way that was vivid but contained. It simplified the narrative, making it easier to digest, easier to moralize, and easier to forget. By doing so, although not intentionally, the story shifted away from the hard questions. Questions about poverty, about trafficking, about how broken systems let this happen. Instead, all eyes were on the doll. The symbol became the story, and the deeper truth, it stayed hidden, just out of the frame. And for the perpetrators, choosing Fan was not random. She was marked by layers of vulnerability. A former orphan, a recovering addict, a woman who was once in the sex trade, all identities society often pushes to the margins. Victimology research tells us this. It's not that women like Fan are weak, it's the society that makes them invisible, and that invisibility makes them easy targets. To her captors, Fan was someone they believed no one would protect and no one would mourn. And so, we're left with a question. When does silence stop being silence and start becoming complicit? When does moral disengagement, that slow, quiet fading of empathy, turn everyday people into silent collaborators in cruelty? It is easy to look at this case and see only monsters. Men who tortured, a child who took part, neighbors who said nothing. But thinking that way gives us simple answers. And this case doesn't offer any. Because what happened inside that apartment in Granville Road wasn't just about individual evil. It was shaped by something deeper, by a city's hidden corners, by places where violence is routine, where silence keeps you safe, and where suffering fades into the background. Structural inequality built the hunting ground. Individual cruelty just stepped into it. The triad underworld gave people like this power and protection. With no real oversight, it became a space where violence didn't just happen, it thrived. And Fan's own invisibility, which was shaped by poverty, stigma, and gender oppression, made her an easy target. And through the lens of trauma theory, Fan's life tells us a deeper story. Child abandonment, institutional neglect, and a lifetime of complex trauma that eroded protective factors and trapped her in coercive environments. In trauma-informed terms, her ability to escape this cycle was systematically dismantled long before her final captivity began. When we ask why she didn't seek help, maybe we should ask this instead. Who in her life had ever truly helped her? The process is slow, insidious. Habituation dulls the ear. Deviance becomes normal. Inaction feeds itself, and a culture of silence wraps it all in denial. Even in the aftermath, when the headlines screamed of a Hello Kitty murder, it was easier to fixate on a doll than to face the deeper truths. This is the power of narrative framing. The media offered us a grotesque symbol, one that sanitized the systematic forces behind the crime. Because if this case was simply a grotesque anomaly, there was no need to ask harder questions. Questions like, why was Fan Man-yee, a woman trying to rebuild her life, left so vulnerable to exploitation? How many others live in that same margin today? How many pleas for help are still ignored, not because we can't hear them, but because we've been conditioned to tune them out? And perhaps the hardest question of all, within our communities, what kinds of violence have slipped quietly into the fabric of everyday life? What truths remain unspoken because it's easier not to see them? If this case reveals anything, maybe it is this: that the true horror was never only what happened inside that apartment. It is how such horror could unfold in plain sight, and how easily we allow ourselves to look away. What do you think about this case? Share your thoughts. Next, please watch The Cyanide Coffee Case. What happens when justice is clouded and the lines between guilt and innocence blur? Discover a case where evidence, media, and rumor collide, leaving us to question what's real, what's hidden, and what's simply too uncomfortable to confront. Stay safe. See you next time.